Yeah, thank you for that. I think I want to sort of start by encouraging us to think about migration and kind of more specifically the management of migration as part of a larger context of Western imperialism. So I think we're seeing increasingly that migration management is a focus for imperialist states that includes Britain. So that means increased kind of militarization and increased enforcement of the border in terms of the channel crossings, for example, but also at the European border. We're obviously seeing very regular drownings in the Mediterranean, and we've seen that for years, but also the deployment of drones and warships to try and divert people trying to cross. That's a similar pattern in the US with the border with Mexico. And as part of that as well, I think we should think about the kind of large scale refugee camps which are being built to contain migrants, often at the edges. So in Europe, that's on the Greek islands. In Australia, it's the kind of islands outside used as detention or prison facilities to hold migrants. So I think we need to be considering the state borders themselves, but also how they are increasingly moving outwards. And that includes, for example, the EU funding militias like the Janjaweed in Sudan to pay them to manage people trying to migrate, or paying for the processing camps in Libya that also detain and sort of divert people trying to cross into Europe. So in both of those examples, the EU is paying for that violence that's committed to migrants, and also changing the balance of power in those areas, right? In the background of that as well as like these huge multinational corporations like arms trade corporations included in that, who invest in those new markets, like the markets for detention centres and surveillance and weapons, and are also lobbying for the continuation of those policies, which is obviously also matched by this huge state spending on the latest surveillance technology and defence technology and other military spending. I think all of us will be aware of the way that kind of capitalism sort of chops up the world and places people and whole regions sort of into specialized parts of the chain of production and also into specific divisions of labor. And so that at one level means that whole regions of the world are made what can no longer actually support the populations that live there, right? Because the whole economy is geared towards producing specific parts of specific commodities for specific markets. And that's, you know, a clear connection also with climate politics, right? In terms of what the future looks like with that in mind. Borders are a really key way that the kind of flow of commodities is managed, and also kind of tying people to specific parts of the world in that chain of production. So I think it's important to bear that in mind, because when we're talking about struggles over migration, that reflects both corporate and political interests when it comes to the management of resources, as well as the management of people, right, in the interest of capitalism and of Western states. And just as a kind of side point there, you know, like extractive industries in Sudan are also involved with the militias in the same way that the EU is. So there's a real connection there between sort of borders, imperialism, and climate change. So that was the kind of first thing I wanted to kind of encourage us to think about. And then the second is what's happening here inside of Britain. So, you know, since the introduction of the hostile environment, there's a really high degree of surveillance of migrants and migrant communities. There's policies kind of making teachers and health workers and banks and landlords and also employers act as border guards. So we're seeing kind of a physical reinforcement of the border and externalization of the border, but also the border becoming embedded in our public services and in workplaces as well. That includes increasing criminalization of migrants. And I don't think I have time to go into this now, but there's a lot to be said about the way that kind of criminality is increasingly being used to sort of strip migrants who have legal status off that legal status and deporting them. I mean, one example that's obviously a very extreme one is the Shamima Begum case, which is been literally stripped of their citizenship. But there's also been a recent case you might have seen, which involves an autistic man in his 20s who has lived in Britain since he was 4 years old, and who the Home Office is trying to deport to Jamaica, where he has not been since he was 4. After his prison sentence is finished. He's in prison under the joint enterprise law. So it's over a theft of a mobile phone, and he didn't even participate in that theft, right? And it's a man with very high support needs, a very vulnerable adult. And this is kind of something that we're seeing a lot, and like I think is something that we should be really aware of. So there's a strategy of surveillance, there's a strategy of criminalisation, but also of deliberate deprivation. So migrants in Britain are often denied really basic welfare provision, like benefits, healthcare. But I think that's often not seen as a sort of key working class area of struggle that it really should be. I think actually many people are probably not actually even aware that the NHS is charging people to use its services, and that you know that includes people who are needing to access like life-saving cancer treatments, maternity services, you know, women getting charged thousands and thousands of pounds for maternity care, as well as obviously workers having to pay a surcharge in order to be able to access NHS services, including people who work in the NHS, right? And I think another example of that is no recourse to public funds, where people are denied access to benefits. That of course includes people who don't have regular status, but it also is a condition on many people's leave to remain. So, you know, it means that people are denied benefits despite having the legal right to live and work here. And that's another issue, which I think really should be seen as a key kind of working class issue. And, you know, what it means is that, say, if you're disabled, you can't get disability living allowance, you can't get social services accommodation, but also people with no recourse to public funds or NRPF are excluded from most homeless shelters. If you're fleeing domestic violence, you can't get a space in a refuge, and even free school meals, right? It's dependent on your family having recourse to public funds. So we're seeing basically a section of the working class being really actively deprived of really basic provision and even emergency support, like refuges. I think that these quite like extreme measures of repression and deprivation, you know, I think migrant solidarity is often really siloed away, right? So, for example, when there's campaigns around benefits, NRPF still doesn't often feature that prominently in those campaigns. And people tend to think about migration as primarily an issue about rhetoric or the Tories kind of sowing division or scapegoating. It's also that, right? But it's also like an actual attack on a section of the working class.
2 minutes left.
Okay, that's fine. And that means that migrant solidarity is often very dominated by NGOs, by charities, service providers. They can do really good work, but they're not really able to like launch the kind of class-based resistance to the state that is needed to address these issues. And it's also a strategic issue, right? Because when we're thinking about NRPF, I think that we need to be analysing that together with the way other ways that welfare provision is being made conditional, right? And the kind of normalisation of saying that some people do not have the right to be housed or to feed their kids. NHS is building a whole infrastructure for taking payments for care. Like, I don't know why we would assume that it's going to stop at migrants. So yeah, just to kind of reinforce and to finish off, the 2 points I kind of want to make is one, that borders, both internal and external to Britain, are key to understanding Britain's role in the world and contemporary imperialism, and that repression and state violence against migrants needs to be considered a key focus for working class struggle rather than the kind of sectional concern. Thank you.